Hey everybody! Today I'll be showing you a step-by-step tutorial on how to make your very own custom incense burners. These are so much fun to make, and all you need is air-dry clay, paint, and resin. So let's get started and jump right in. For my burners, I'll be using Amako air-dry clay in the color white, but you can use whatever brand you prefer. I personally just really like the quality of this one, and it's pretty easy to work with. And I'll be using parchment paper to keep the clay from sticking to the wood surface that I'm working on. Before I start working with the clay, I like to print out the shapes I want my incense burners to be. That way I can just roll out my clay and cut around the outline. It makes the process much easier. I'll be rolling out my clay with this small rolling pin, but you could just as easily use a glass. I also have this really handy clay tool that has different magnetic attachments. To create the shapes, I'll be using the blade attachment. So I'm going to start by softening up my clay. Ideally, you want your clay to be soft, slightly damp, and malleable. If your clay has dried out too much, you can add a small amount of water. You just want to be mindful not to add too much, as this can cause cracking during the drying process. Once my clay had become a little bit easier to work with, I began to build 4 round shapes to make sure that each burner would be similar in size. When creating the shape of your incense burner, you'll want to take into account where the ashes from your incense will be falling. You'll want to essentially create a big enough surface to catch those ashes so you can burn incense safely. You will also want to make sure that your project is at least 1/4 inch thick to prevent cracking and to keep your burner from breaking due to being too brittle. Once my clay is evenly rolled out to my desired thickness, I use a small amount of water to smooth out the surface from any cracks or wrinkles. I place my paper template directly on the clay and very lightly, evenly press the shape in so it will stay in place when I trace around it. Using a rolling pin or a glass can also help to press your shapes into your clay. So now I'm working my way around the base with my cutting tool. You can also use an X-Acto knife, but I found these bladed clay tools to be a little less sharp, making them a safer option and a little bit more manageable when working with the clay. I kind of just peel away pieces as I go and slowly work on carving out the shape. After I'm finished, I take off the paper and start to smooth out the edges with my fingertips and add a small amount of water. The knife tool can create some sharper edges, but I wanted to go with a smoother finished look, but remember not to use excessive water here to prevent cracking. Now this step in the process I find to be the most difficult and frustrating, so be kind with yourself. Sometimes it takes a few tries to really create the shape that you're going for. My advice is to be as gentle with the clay as possible and take your time. To create this concave shape, I just press the shape into the clay while adding support on both sides. You can use a little bit of water on your fingertips to keep your clay malleable, prevent drying, and smooth out any surface cracks that may arise. Now I'm creating the center of the burner where the small hole will be that will hold my incense stick in place. I'm creating a ball shape for this one, but you can create any shape that you'd like or just make a hole without a shape altogether. It's really up to you. Once I have the shape that I like, I use my needle tool to create small crisscross ridges on the bottom. This will add some grit so the attachment can properly adhere to the burner. I'm also going in and adding this texture to the base where I'll be attaching this piece. I created this mixture called slip. It's just clay mixed with water. This will act as a sort of glue when attaching separate pieces of clay together. I used a small amount of slip where I created those textured ridges and add the attachment to the base of my project, pressing gently. Next, I use my needle tool to create the hole that my incense stick will go into. Now you want to take into account that as your burner dries, it will shrink from losing moisture. So you want to make your hole a little bit bigger for this reason. I press my needle down into the clay in an even swirling motion so the hole has an even diameter. Once you are happy with your final product, you will want to dry your clay. For your drying time, follow the instructions for the specific clay that you are using. For best results, dry on something that has an aerated base, like this shelf or a drying rack. The airflow will allow your project to dry evenly. Check on your burners periodically to smooth over any cracks that may develop with a small amount of clay. Many times, this will save your project if you can catch it early. Adding a plastic covering, such as this or a plastic bag, will allow your project to cure slowly, which is an additional safety for preventing cracking and breakage. Once your burners are completely dry, it's time to sand them. I have varied sandpaper grits as well as this sanding block for creating an even surface. Now it's really important to make sure that your clay is bone dry before sanding and painting to avoid any deformities that the extra moisture might create. I just use even strokes and smooth out any blemishes or uneven sections. I use coarser grit for the sections that need a little extra work and use a fine grit just to lightly smooth out my surface. It doesn't take much pressure as air-dry clay is quite soft once it's dry. I decided to use some gesso from the brand Golden to ease the painting process. This will create a surface for your paint to sit on top of as opposed to just being absorbed into the clay. This step is not necessarily essential, but it can really decrease the amount of paint that you have to use and will make your painting process an easier overall experience. Once I add a coat of gesso to each side of my incense burners, I give them a little bit of time to dry before I start using my acrylic paints. So I started out painting a base coat on all of my burners with acrylic paint and drew all of my designs with a graphite pencil. It takes a couple of coats to fully cover the clay, so I allow drying time in between coats. My first design that I'm painting is a cheetah silhouetted by the setting sun. This one has a really warm color palette with a deep, rich color base. One of the things that I did notice upon painting, however, was that my paint would slightly bubble up in small sections during the drying process. If you are dealing with this as well, you can use a small pin to pop the paint bubble and gently press the air out of the hole. We are going to be covering the paintings with resin later on, so the blemishes shouldn't really be too significant. I know when I was painting my designs, it took a couple of coats of paint to really get a solid, vibrant look, so don't be afraid to really build up your paint. The less opaque your paints are, the easier time you will have creating your designs. For my next incense burner, I'll be using a cool toned palette to create a moonlit botany scene. On the upper section, I painted the moon phases in white. The midsection and bottom portion of the burner has these really whimsical passion flower blooms that I'll be painting with spotted moths. Passion flower is one of my favorite plants. I think the flowers are so gorgeous, so I wanted to create a painting that encompasses that beauty. I also added gold texture to the stars and moonbeams. I really love how this one turned out. I also painted the base of this burner with golden paints, and I have to say, out of all of the assorted paints that I used, I think this brand performed the best on this project. For my next painting, I decided to create another botany scene, but this time I will be painting California poppies. I live in California, and if you've ever been here in the springtime, you will see all of these bright orange poppies all over our hillsides. It looks like a little fairyland out here on the West Coast. It's so pretty. So I have all of my blooms and poppy pods and some twinkling stars in the background. On this burner, I thought a little outside of the box and attached this quartz crystal cluster with some UV resin to the surface of my piece. Don't be afraid to try new things and add special features like this, as long as it can stand the heat from incense coals. In addition to my rainbow beams, I added some Art Deco style designs that are pretty simplistic and added some gold paint to match the golden color of the incense stick holder. I really love the dimension of this burner. It's simple, but I also think it's my most unique design. Once your incense burners are completely dry, it's time to move on to the resin process. I will be using the brand Signature Craft UV resin in high gloss and a torch lighter to make sure any bubbles in the resin can rise to the surface. Nail polish remover or acetone can be used to clean your paintbrush, as water will not work on UV resin. A cheap brush is definitely recommended just in case you damage it. A pair of disposable gloves are a necessary safety precaution, as well as a respirator that has cartridges specially made for organic vapors and fumes. It's also important to leave a window open when working with resin to add a little airflow to your space. A UV lamp or flashlight can be used to cure your resin, or you can also use the sunlight if you don't have access to a blue UV light. And popsicle sticks are a really useful tool to smooth out the surface of the resin or pick up any debris that might fall into it. I'm going to start with the back first. When you're working with resin, you really want to avoid anything with UV light, which is what hardens and cures your resin. That includes sunlight. Even a small amount of sunlight coming through your window can harden the resin while you're working with it, which can lead to a damaged surface or uneven finish, but a standard house light should be fine while working with your resin. When I first began to coat my burners with resin, I only use a little bit at a time to avoid dripping. When your project dries, sometimes those extra drips can be really hard to remove, so go light to avoid this. Then I lightly hit the resin with my torch lighter at a safe distance as to not burn my project, but allow the bubbles to rise to the surface and pop. Then I just continue this process for all four, examining the sides as I go to catch any drips. I really love working with UV resin as opposed to regular resin or epoxy due to your ability to paint it onto any shape or surface. When exposed to UV light, the resin cures really fast. I've also found that the UV resin doesn't yellow over time like regular resin does. Now, UV resin is more expensive, but if you are simply using it to coat and protect things, as opposed to pouring larger amounts into molds, I found it definitely worth the extra money and will make your project much easier. I just want to let you know that the next 25 seconds will contain flashlight use, so please skip ahead if you are sensitive to those types of visuals. So now I'm going to be curing my resin, and while I'm only showing a small clip of this process, I'll be going in depth a little bit while I work on glazing the front of my incense burners. When your resin is looking even, glossy, and bubble-free, you can begin the curing process. You will want to keep your vapor mask on as the light is creating a chemical reaction, and sometimes you can even see the fumes rising during this process, something that you really don't want to be breathing in. You can turn off the lights so you can fully see where your UV light is being directed, or leave the lights on, whatever you find works best for you. I purchased my UV light online. I see some people using UV light boxes, and some people even cure their resin in the sun. I actually like to do a combination of both. I've found that curing the resin can take a little longer than the directions will often instruct. So I will hit it with a UV light directly for about 20 to 30 minutes, which is where I suppose a UV light box would actually come in handy. Essentially, you want to make sure that you have even light exposure so the resin can fully cure. I find after using my UV light, my resin is usually still quite tacky and not fully cured, so I will often use sunlight in the final stages. If you cure in direct hot sunlight, however, your project can bubble up and create deformities. So just make sure the sunlight is indirect. If any debris falls into your resin, use your popsicle stick to try to gently remove as quickly as possible as to not damage your project. Once your resin fully cures, you are able to start using your incense burners. I adore how these all came out, and though they do take a little bit of patience, this is such a fun project and the possibilities are endless. This was my first time using air dry clay for this type of a project, but I have a feeling I'll be making more in the future. If you decide to make your own, let me know how yours is coming along in the comment section. Also, if you have any questions throughout the creative process, I'd be happy to answer them in the comment section too. If you're an artist, crafter, or simply an art lover, be sure to follow my channel for more creativity-focused videos. I create a lot of unique content I think you'd enjoy. I hope you create something that you love, and I hope you have a fun time doing it. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.